I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry and I'll be your host. Today we have the pleasure of talking with Amanda Carrasco. Amanda is a family survivor of homicide and sexual assault who uses her experience to impact the lives of her community and those that have been touched by the criminal legal system. She is also the author of Becoming the Brave One, a book that is out this August with Blue Hat Publishing. Amanda is a certified facilitator of restorative justice, which has helped shape her beliefs around justice, healing, and transformation. She holds 4 master's degrees from multiple nations, 2 of them in law. This is going to be a fantastic conversation. Amanda, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
And before we really get started, listeners should be warned that this episode will make reference to sexual abuse and other forms of serious violence and harm. So, Amanda, you've written this new amazing memoir called Becoming the Brave One. And it's organized into 2 parts, right? Part 1 focuses on your journey through all the harm that you experienced. And then part 2 focuses on your journey through your healing. And I was thinking when I was trying to figure out how to start this conversation that maybe we just kind of follow along with the arc of your book, if that sounds okay to you.
Yeah, that sounds great.
And one of the things though, before we even follow that 1-2 kind of arc, the theme of justice, right? The whole book is kind of a reflection on different ideas about justice. And many people think about justice just as courts and law, but that isn't really how you think about justice. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about this framework. What is justice to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up, like everybody else, picturing courtrooms, judges, police officers, prisons, that is what justice looked like. And then became a victim of crime multiple times in, different circumstances and became deeply impacted by this system that we call the justice system. And I saw how how much it can actually harm versus heal. All people, not just victims, not just offenders, but communities, everybody. So I think that it's really important to know that that's not actually justice. When we go back to Aristotle, and Plato, the great deep thinkers, they talked about justice in our sense of community. Wrestling with this concept of what does that mean that justice is about community and about our relationships, and starting to unpack how when harm happens, first of all, there's a ripple effect. It's not usually just 2 people involved. There are communities that are impacted. There are, our ambulance attendants, our police officers, people that are coming to the scenes that are that are impacted by the things that they see and witness. And then, family members, when someone is incarcerated, that ripple effect into that family of the loss of that family member and the strain that it puts on them economically, emotionally, and then our victims, right? And what happens to them and how it changes their lives and their relationships, in the present and the future, because it's going to continue to impact you. And so looking at justice as this brokenness, that's happened out of this harm, and how can we repair and heal that together? um, no one else can heal for us. We have to do that ourselves. And so when we're looking to prosecutors, when we're looking to judges to bring healing, we're going to be sadly mistaken, because that's not how it works. We have to do the work. And we as communities need to hold each other accountable, socially when things happen. And so that's where we bring justice back into this community setting. But it means we have to be active participants in justice and not bystanders or witnesses and let someone else take care of it.
Yeah, I mean, they're right. I mean, we could spend a whole hour just talking about what you said, right? Because your definition of justice is really about relationships. And the legal system's definition of justice is figuring out who did what to whom, finding, whether or not there's reasonable doubt or enough proof to convict someone of a crime. And if they are convicted, they are guilty. And then we have to punish them. And there's accountability through prison. And healing isn't necessarily the goal unless someone is healed by the process of having the person who caused harm be punished. Right. And so that's a very different conception of justice. And I love how that vision that you have of relational healing sort of animates your whole book. And it didn't have to, right? Because one of the things that struck me as sort of amazing is that you embraced this holistic, beautiful view of justice given your experiences. Because you did experience tremendous abuse that started at a very early age by people who should have loved you and protected you and didn't. And so I'm wondering if we could kind of start with that. Like the first person who really harmed you was a sibling.
Right. Yeah. I had an older sibling who sexually assaulted me for the first 10 years of my life. Um, and, I was raised in a very sort of dysfunctional family. When people even say to me, how many brothers and sisters do you have? I say no. Like you can't ask me that question. Like you have to define the parameters. Do you want to know step siblings? Do you want to know half siblings? Do you want to know ex step siblings? Like it's complicated. My parents have been through multiple marriages, children with various partners. So it's complicated.
Yeah,
So,
I was actually I did sort of try to go backwards and figure that out, and I had to just stop. I was like, wow, this is a complex family structure for sure.
it is, it is, and I'm the only one of me, like, my parents only had me, I don't have any other full brothers and sisters, they're all, either half step, X step, all those things, so, it definitely is a little bit complicated, but I still felt like a love for my family even though we didn't get to grow up together, there were various stages at various times where I had some level of connection to each of them, and I kind of felt that loss, honestly. Like I really wanted, siblings to grow up with. I wanted older siblings that looked out for me. I wanted younger siblings that I could care for, and both of that. And so at incremental times, I got some of that in ways, but not in the way that I had really hoped and wanted. And so, yeah, one of my older siblings, was one of my abusers. And it was, an older sibling that I was looking to protect me and didn't. And so, like that was obviously incredibly hard. It was through all my formative years and very damaging to like my perception of self, my understanding in terms of sexuality, like any and all of those things. So it's definitely hard when the people that are supposed to take care of you, become the people that hurt you, the people that are supposed to love you, that betray you. What do you do with that? And again, I'm going to tie that back to that whole piece of justice because that's a break in that relationship. But that relationship existed. There were some good things in addition to the bad things. And so it becomes this really weird mixed bag that you kind of have to navigate through because there's both. Just because the bad happened, it doesn't erase the good things. And what do you do with this? What do you do with the anger and the sometimes hatred or, all those things, but also the fact that you have these happy memories together too. Those were just as legitimate, just as real. And so trying to juxtapose those together, like it can be super complicated to work through that. I don't know. I wouldn't say that it is easier if it's a stranger. I'm not going to say that because I don't know that per se. But I think there's a few less complexities to it because there's not that relationship there. So
Yeah, I think you're right. We're not very good at the and, right? I mean, when I say we, I mean the human species. We're not good at the this was really hard and it was really in parts okay.
right.
That's a very complex thing. But
Yeah.
and it wasn't just your brother though, right? I mean, you also had an abusive experience with your uncle.
hmm Yeah, that's true. That's so funny. I was like, "Oh, yeah, that's right." Yeah, that was earlier on as well. Yeah, I mean, and there were multiple, like, there were friends of my brothers, like, the abuse was actually quite extensive in terms of that. So, and I mean, for me, it was something that I grew up with. It was life. And I think for a lot of people, it's life, outside people looking at it as like, "Oh my gosh, this is so horrific," and, but it was just your day to day, like, this is just the way that life is, and I know there's so many other people out there because the statistics in terms of, family members or even definitely, close family friends type of thing that commit these abuses and atrocities, it's so, so high. These are people that we
Yeah.
trust with our children, people that we know. My family didn't know, that it was happening with my uncle until it came out with his own children. So, yeah, you go to family gatherings and, I don't want to encourage people to be afraid of their own family members, but I also don't want them to just make assumptions either. Like I always believe everybody's capable of everything. And it all
Hmm.
just depends on like circumstances and context, right? Because we like to think, oh, I would never do that or they would never do that. But you don't really know that.
Yeah. And then, you had found I was just reading this and I thought, how many awful things can one person kind of experience and then endure? And in your case, not just endure, but actually move through to come to a place of thriving, not because of what happened to you, maybe despite of it or, incorporating all of it in together. Um, but that wasn't just it. It wasn't just your uncle and just your brother. There was a woman that you just adored named Susan. Could you tell us about her and what happened?
Oh, I can tell you about Susan for sure. So Susan, I call her my sister because she was as close to a sister as I could have. She adopted me when I was 8. There's actually a really great story. We ended up in the same Christian school, and her mom, she went home one day and said, "I made a new friend at school." And her mom said, "Oh, that's great. Like, do you want to bring your new friend over?" And Susan said, "Yeah, like that's wonderful." And she was 8 years older than me. So she was 16 and I was 8. And so Susan comes home with this friend, to play with. And here's this little 8-year-old girl, which was me. Yeah, there was something, obviously that Susan just saw in me, and she just decided to love me, and that was huge. She didn't have a specific reason. We weren't blood related, but she chose me, and she would always, when she was alive, she introduced me as her sister, and so that's
Mm,
why, like, I will still introduce her as my sister because she was to me, and that's how she saw me. So, and the family, all like we all understood that that's the way that it was. So she loved me like a big sister. She looked out for me. Those things that I wanted as a young kid, from my biological family that they weren't able to give me, she really did. She looked out for me. She held me accountable. But, I knew with her that I was loved unconditionally, no matter what I did. I also knew when I did things she didn't approve of, like she would let me know. So she had that really great balance. Because even when she was, getting on me for something or whatever, I had this boyfriend she really didn't like. And but I never wavered. I never questioned whether she loved me and accepted me. That was always just unconditional. Even when we were working through those things. So, things with my own family, had really been in a bad state, and so I was living with her and her husband and their kids for some time, and it was great in terms of I loved being able to be with them, and it felt like I was part of a family, because there were the kids, there was her and Dean and I, and so that part of it felt great. It also felt a little weird because I'm constantly with kids and we're having to clean up toys and change diapers and, the family life that you're like, "Oh my gosh, this is exhausting." So, there were some challenges with family life too, but I was really grateful. And she sheltered me from a lot of things that I did not know were even happening, some of the abusive things that were happening between him and her. I mean, because I was her little sister and she wanted to protect me. And, but I know those things now. And so, ultimately it's because of her that I'm even still here because he did make a plan to kill us all. And her and I had gotten into a fight. I had wanted to go on a road trip, with a guy that I liked, and she was wise and said, "No, that's ridiculous. Like you're 16, you can't go on this, trip to another province with some guy. Forget it." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, you're so restrictive, and you don't ever let me have fun." Like typical teenage, pouty, not get my way. So I had spent the night at a friend's house, and that was the night that he had planned, and it happened that I wasn't there. But had I been there, I would not be alive. So she protected me emotionally and physically.
Right, and I think we may need to back up a little bit because I don't know that our listeners know exactly what happened. So Susan was married to Dean, and she had 3 young children, right?
She did, yeah, her oldest was not Dean's biological child, but he did legally adopt him. She had a child when she was 18, and left, his father, and then, met Dean not that long later. And so her and Dean got married, and he adopted her 3-year-old. Well, he wasn't 3 at the time, but at the time that she passed, he was 3. When you experience things, sometimes they're just frozen in time. So he'll like forever be 3. And
Yeah.
but yeah, so they got married, and then she got pregnant with twins that were his biologically. So there were the 3 young kids, and Dean, Susan, and myself that were all together.
Right, and so that night you had stayed out with a friend, in part in reaction to Susan sort of being a little bit bossy. And then what happened?
Okay, so that night I had gone and stayed at my friend's house, and she gave me the phone. Susan had called and said, I know you're really angry with me, but when you come home tomorrow, can we talk this through? Like, it's important to me that we work this out. And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. Like, I can do that. And so her very last words to me ever were, I love you, as we hung up
Mm,
the phone.
mm,
And I mean, that was just her. Like, she always wanted to be in good relationship, wherever possible. She cared, but she would still, address, hey, there's a conflict here, but let's work through it. So I love that about her. And I think especially being 16, like there's no good time to have trauma, but when you're young, it's even harder. You have less skills and tools and things to be able to work through stuff and understand things. And so, at 16, had we not had that conversation, I think there would have been an even deeper level of devastation for me that things had been left in such a bad state. So the fact that she had called, the fact that we had talked and she had said, I love you, as her last words, like that was Susan. Like that encapsulates her.
mm.
And so the next morning, I woke up because, there was another phone call, but it was my biological dad because someone had called him and said, hey, there was a fire last night at Susan and Dean's house, and a woman's body was pulled out, and we don't know who it was. And so my biological dad was trying to track me down to see. And so I answered the phone and he said, hey, you're alive. And I was like, yeah. And, like,
Right.
he and I weren't on the best terms. So I was like, what is wrong with you? Like to call and say I'm alive. And then that's when he told me, he said, Amanda, they found a body at Susan's. There's been a fire. And I was like,
Oh,
what the heck? So the person I was staying with, my friend Shelly, we got in her car and drove over there to see like what's going on. And yeah, sure enough, like there's fire departments there, police is there, and so it was very surreal. It was definitely like you're living in a TV show at that point, because your brain cannot comprehend, that's my home, that's where I live. And so the police officer came over to our car because we just stopped and are staring. And he said, like, why are you here? Like, can I help you? And I said, yeah, I live there. And he goes, are you Amanda? And I said, yeah. And he said, okay. He said, I have a postcard for you, which was like the weirdest thing ever. And I was like, okay, and he's like, here's a postcard from your mom, like my biological mom, and like mailed a postcard to the house.
oh,
So
wow.
it was so surreal, like the entire thing. And then I know that he and Shelly somehow like exchanged contact information because Shelly was basically like, well, like she can't, no one could stay in that home anymore. And so she's like, well, she'll stay with me. Um, and there's parts that I don't remember much after that. Like, it's like there's a gap. And so I remember being outside of the house. I remember talking to the police officer. And then I don't remember anything until being in the interrogation room. I have no idea what happened in that span. I don't know how I got there. I don't know anything. I just remember being in the interrogation room, and I remember him asking me questions, like some things that were just sort of normal general questions. And then I remember him asking me specific things um, in terms of the house and whatever. And because I had very little information at that point, I honestly thought there
Right.
was some kind of electrical fire or something,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
I knew that Susan was dead because I mean that had to be her body. I knew that one of the twins was at that point airlifted to Vancouver General Hospital because of being in the fire, and they thought smoke inhalation, which we found out later wasn't the case, but they thought that the 3-year-old was also in hospital, but in good, condition. And one of the twins was missing, like he was just gone, and no one knew where he was. So it was, and again, like it's just so surreal because it's so weird. Like it's like, what is happening? None
Right,
of
of
it makes any
course.
sense at all.
No.
And so, and especially that, Josiah being missing was especially weird because I'm like, okay, well, it's a house fire. Did someone just like take him and run? Like what's happening? Like my brain couldn't comprehend any of it at all.
No, of
And
course.
and finally the questions that he was asking, I remember it was like the pieces connected in my brain. And I looked at him and said, you mean this wasn't an accident? And
Right.
he's looking at me like, no, like obviously not. And I mean, I'm 16, and all that was there was the police officer and a lady who was kind of like transcribing or doing some kind of, like
Oh.
stuff. And that was it. And I just learned that my family had been murdered. Like one of the twins
Mm,
is gone, Susan's dead. One's in the hospital, maybe not gonna live, who, did not live, Josiah did, or David did pass away. Um, and that was that. And I started sobbing and lost it. He just said, "I'll give you a minute." And so they left me alone in this room,
oh my
just
gosh.
learning that my family's like all been murdered. Like it was horrific. Like it was definitely nothing less than horrific for sure. So yeah, and as the case unfolded, Josiah's body was, found a week later. He had been strangled. Susan had been strangled before the house was set on fire. And, at that time, I thought that it was a random stranger. I thought someone came into the home and did this. But through the course of events, evidence being presented, speaking with people, I eventually, again, same thing, pieces came together. No, this wasn't a random stranger. This was Dean. This was the
Mm,
man committed to love us, take care of us, a man that I knew and loved like a big brother. No, this was him. He did
mm.
this.
That's just awful. And again, just such a betrayal. Like, I mean, you had such a time as a young person of just so much betrayal by people who you loved. I mean, it's terrible. Um, and yet you somehow, I won't sort of ruin all the backstory about what happens with, what happens with Dean exactly, but how did you come across this notion of restorative justice and how did you think this is something you are interested in, given the level of harm that you had experienced over the course of your young life?
Well, I think that victims know full well, that the current system doesn't work well. Like the failings of it and the fact that it didn't bring healing, it didn't bring relief. Even the guilty verdict, like I had to testify at the trial when I was 17 to help
Against Dean.
convict him
Against
against
Dean,
Dean.
yeah.
Yep, the prosecutor had me there. And, a guilty verdict just didn't fix it. It didn't bring my sister and the kids back. It didn't make me feel less angry. It didn't make me feel less pain or loss. So, it didn't do a lot. It did take someone who obviously was a danger to others off the streets. And so I could see that component of it. But that's it, like, it really
Yeah.
doesn't offer a lot for us, and how do we deal with our lives and piece together and even deal with kind of, like, what happened? So, you're left with that, and I just kind of went on with life, and I carried all of it with me, the hate, the anger, all of that for a long time, and I don't remember exactly, the pinpoint moment where I came across restorative justice. But I did come to hear of the concept and it seemed interesting to me. And the more I learned about it, though, the more I realized that I had already been a part of it without knowing. Because I was able to have a conversation with the sibling who sexually assaulted me on my own, which I do not recommend. Please, if you're going to look at restorative justice, please do it in safe ways. I just didn't know, but in that context, it was safe for me because he was open and willing to have a conversation with me. And so the thing with restorative justice is that it's built on the premise that the victim is the center. In our current system, it's adversarial, and we pit people, communities, state offenders, we pit people against each other. And so restorative justice says, well, wait a second, let's stop pitting pitting people against each other, and let's look at what's happened. So first of all, like, who was harmed, how were they harmed, and what do they need? And so it puts victims back into the middle. Right now, like, we become witnesses. I mean, I used to get updates, from watching the TV and the news, and, the family, we would all sort of talk to each other and that kind of a thing. But like, it was hard to get information. You didn't feel involved in the process. You just watched it unfold. We were at their mercy, like 100%. And even in the book, I talk about, one of the tactics that the prosecutor used, which I understand, especially as I've got, more involved in the law. I understand why and how lawyers do some of the things they do, good or bad, to win their case. I'm not advocating for it. I just say I understand it because that's the way the system works. And so that's the thing I love about restorative justice is it's not this angling and maneuvering, because we're all in this together and we're looking at how we address this. How do we hold people accountable? How do we acknowledge what has happened? It's a safer space to really talk about it. Victims can then get more information, especially when you have a victim or a perpetrator, sorry, that pleads guilty. There is no trial. And so lots of times there's a lot of questions that go unanswered. And so victims again are at a loss. They're left with these questions. So bringing people together to talk about things and address those needs. Some of the needs are answers. We need answers. In my particular case, I did have a lot of the answers because we did go to trial. The family did talk with each other. We understood a lot of things. But when I came to know about restorative justice, I had carried so much anger and pain. And I realized that that shouldn't all be mine to carry. And so I initiated the process because I wanted to talk to him because he was someone that I thought loved me, cared about my sister and the kids, and someone that I cared about. And he did this. And I needed him to know the pain that he caused. You know, Susan and the babies can't talk anymore. They can't say anything. But I could. And so that was why I chose to pursue it. It did take a long time. It took several years for me to understand the concept of what it was, to then look at how it would apply here. And like I say, the fact that I'd already essentially had a restorative justice circle with a person who had harmed me in a major way, and be able to talk to him and ask him questions, because I did have questions for him, and hear, his side of things, that was very significant. And I think it contributed to me being able to talk to Dean, because talking to Dean was the hardest thing I've ever done.
Let's contrast the two situations, the one with your brother and the one with Dean. So your brother was sent to a juvenile reformatory or something like that. And then you lost contact for a period of time, and then you reinitiated contact with him. Is that what happened?
We had very limited contact, through family members. So, I mean, I would know how he was doing. He would know how I was doing. If I was in a place somewhere that someone was on the phone with him, then I might have a conversation. But it was definitely very limited for sure
And
for
it
a
must have
while.
been right. It must have been so hard because there he was sort of participating in this family structure and he had caused you tremendous harm. And so you had a sit down with him and it was just you and him. And he was open to that, which is kind of extraordinary. What do you think made him open to that conversation, if you
I
know?
think, yeah, I think he had done some work himself, and I think that he was remorseful. I think he did love me as a little sibling, and I think he saw the harm, and I think that he carried that. And so when I wanted to talk, I think he wanted to. And this is the thing, like, what someone has done does not have to define them for the rest of their life. You know, I don't think he's that same person at all. And my work with people who are incarcerated, seeing the difference in them, I think it matters. I think people can change, including people that commit sexual harm, which I know we like to think of them as the lowest of the low. And it's very challenging. It is a great harm. I'm not trying to minimize in any way. I think there's also some psychological aspects when you commit sexual harm, but I also think that we have to be realistic about the percentages of people that commit sexual harm and the numbers of them that have been sexually harmed. We're
Mhm.
perpetuating cycles. Like that's what it is. We're victims becoming offenders. And so we have to keep that in mind and that we have to bring healing to stop these cycles. And when we demonize people that commit sexual harm, we're not allowing them the ability to change. We're not allowing them to get help. We're not holding them accountable. And that is huge, for stopping these cycles, especially as it continues through families, generations and generations. So this is really, really important. And he had done some really hard work. And so, being open to talking to me, I mean, he'll have to answer that specifically himself, like why he wanted to talk to me, but I'm glad that he did. So I think that it took an incredible amount of bravery for my brother to be willing to talk to me, and especially the way that he was. I know of other families that have tried sort of similar circumstances, and the person may have been quote unquote willing to talk, but they weren't willing to be held accountable. And my brother was willing to be held accountable. He was willing to admit, what he did, give me specific answers for gaps in my memory that I had, and he filled those gaps. Um, and be fully transparent and honest with me. And so we were able to repair our relationship because of that, because he didn't minimize anything, he didn't justify anything. It was me who initiated and said, "Where did this come from?" You know?
Right. Yeah, and I think you're right. It's so when people cause harm, there's so much shame. For the folks who are really willing to take a look at their behavior, there's feelings of guilt and there's so much shame. And you talk in your book about this concept of toxic shame. Um, and I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about that because it is such a powerful emotion. Shame is one of those emotions that can sort of stop people in their tracks and keep them stuck for far, far too long, sometimes forever, because it's just so difficult to work through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that my educational process on guilt and shame really stems a lot from Brene Brown. She's done some incredible work on that as a shame
She
researcher.
has. Mhm.
Phenomenal, phenomenal. And I think it's so important that we understand the difference between the two, because guilt says I've done something wrong, and guilt is healthy and important. But shame says you are wrong, you are terrible, you are worthless, you are nothing, and that's just not true. Like there's not a person on this planet that is worthless or, you know,
Or the
like
sum of the worst thing they've ever done, right? I mean, like, we are
yes,
all more than the worst thing we've ever done.
exactly, 100%. Like there's so much more to us. But and when you carry shame, shame is going to actually perpetuate more bad decisions, potentially more harm because you believe these horrible things about yourself and what's the point, and just give in to them. Versus guilt which says I did this wrong thing. Why did I do this wrong thing? I don't want to do this wrong thing again. How do I be different, and distinguish it from yourself, from your being, the act versus who you are as a person. So it's really, really important to know that. And it's also important for us to like internalize that in ourselves, but use that same framework when we look at others, and I think that I can't remember, oh, what, no, what, the book that Oprah and Bruce Perry, I think is his name, that they did, where they frame it as like, what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. Because we're so like, I see it all the time, like, what is wrong with you? What's wrong with you? No, no, but like, what happened to you? Because saying what's wrong with you means you have some fundamental like flaws and are a incomplete, imperfect person, like a failure. But when we say, like, what happened to you, it's looking at the actions that have had an impact on you. And again, that's very, very different. And the things that have happened to me do not make me be me, but they can
Mhm.
impact my decisions and what I do. So
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
it's important that we have these distinctions. And so when we're harmed, we're looking at others and going, what happened here? How did we get here? What could make this person get to this place of doing this? I think that was fundamental for my understanding of the people that harmed me. What could have happened to you for us to get to this
Mhm.
place? You know?
And so you come to this place of healing with your brother, but then there's Dean, and that's a really different situation for you, right? Why is it so different?
So the difference is Dean's case is complicated because he doesn't take responsibility. He's not being held accountable. It's difficult in the age of like an abolitionist movement. I refuse to call myself an abolitionist just because I do go to Dean's hearings and I do say, please keep him in jail because I don't believe that he has changed. I don't believe he's done the work, to deal with what he did, why he did it, and then not harm someone else. Do I think that change and transformation is possible? Yes. I'm going to hope that and believe that for every single person. However, I'm not going to just say like it's all good and it's possible. So let's just let everybody go. Like, no, we have to also have public safety in mind. So I try to hold both of those things in my hand, that people can change. And, you know, we do need safety. So, oh, sorry, I can take a breath.
Take a breath, take a moment. I mean,
Okay.
this is a lot of painful stuff that we're talking about and a lot of complex stuff, right? So
Right.
with Dean, he hasn't done sort of the work, the introspection that often comes with ideas of remorse. And remorse is often linked, whether it's correct or not, right? There's some social scientists that say you don't need remorse to be safe to be released. But I understand what you're saying in the sense that, without that piece of it, it's hard to know where he sort of stands and reflects on what happened in his house at that time. But I'm also wondering, outside of those cases with your brother or with Dean, what do you think represents true accountability? How, in the United States, it's prison, right? That's all we've got. That's all we offer people is prison. To your point about restorative justice kind of popping up here and there, that is happening, but not on any kind of scale. And so, what do you think accountability should look like, and what role does prison and do lengthy prison sentences in serious cases play in terms of providing accountability?
Yeah, see, I don't think that prison is accountability. Um, I think that prison is a place that we put people, but I think accountability is an intrinsic thing. It's not something that you can make someone do. It's a place that they have to come to themselves. So we can change their geographic location and put them in a prison, but that's not gonna make them be accountable. It could. It does in some situations. Some people do go to prison and think about what they did and it impacts them. There's a low percentage of that, but it does happen sometimes. I always say I feel like people that come out of prison changed have changed in spite of prison, not because of it. I don't know what people think, but I've been in prisons in the world. I've been in the largest prison in Mexico City. I got the privilege and honor to run a program there in April of this year. I've been in prisons in the United States and in Canada, and they're not transformational places. They're places that perpetuate harm. I volunteered with an organization called CROP. They work in California and they're working in the prisons and on reentry. These were men, 4 men that were incarcerated together that changed in spite of the system. And they were revolutionary to my healing journey and have now become an integral part of my community. And so they were super big on accountability. And I remember the first time that I ever met Jason Bryant and Ted Gray. And, we were in a circle and we were all talking and they said, I murdered someone. Only I knew their backstories. Like I knew why they were incarcerated. Neither of them pulled a trigger or technically ended a person's life, but yet they framed it as I murdered someone, because of their involvement, because of the connection, period. They were owning 100% of their 10%. I feel like they were owning 150% of their 10%,
Mm,
but to see that, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, like, this is possible," and so it's changed how I see and do everything, and so accountability does not require a prison, and that's why people think restorative justice is soft on crime, because some of the outcomes don't include prison, and so we go,
mhm.
"Oh, that's nothing, like, that they get off easy." Oh, no, they don't. Sitting with the person that you harmed, walking through what their needs are, being held accountable, owning 100% of your 10%. There's nothing. Nothing easy about that. And
Mhm.
it's more transformative than having to go be put in a cell where you're not treated like a human being.
Mhm.
Like, the prisons are horrific. People are coming out worse than going in, and we wonder why. Why can't you just come out of prison and now be a good contributing member of society? Because we're not treating them like humans. And that's where the breakdown is. Yeah, it's horrific.
Yeah. And, you were talking about ACEs scores, the adverse childhood. What does ACEs stand
Experiences.
for?
Yeah, adverse
Adverse
childhood
childhood
experiences.
experiences. And I often say, which is pretty much what you were saying, is that if show me a person who's committed an act of violence, and I can show you someone who once themselves was the victim of violence, right? So, I mean, it is really prisons, of course, are places of violence. So we are perpetuating cycles of harm in the name of justice, which is defined sort of in this binary, you're guilty and therefore must be punished, as opposed to your vision, which is relational and healing. So it's an interesting and important model. And I'm wondering if you could, I know that you have a deep faith, and I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the concept of forgiveness as it relates to this conversation, because you could go to a restorative justice, there could be healing, but what about forgiveness and what role does it play, if any?
Yeah. It's hard. I have a conflicting relationship with the church. I love Jesus with my whole entire heart. That's not a question whatsoever. My relationship with the church, that's a little iffy. But and a part of it is because, like, growing up in the church, forgiveness is shoved down your throat. You are to forgive every bad thing that anybody does to you, especially church leadership. They definitely want to be forgiven. Like, they deserve it, they expect it. And it is, it's abused, like, it's weaponized. Forgiveness is weaponized within the church. And that breaks my heart because I just don't see that with Jesus. I really see him holding people accountable, but also that unconditional love. It's literally like Susan used to be. Like, she literally was Jesus in my life because she
Mm,
would hold my feet to the fire, but I never questioned her love and acceptance of me. And there is a way that we can do that. It's not easy, but it's possible and it's necessary to have those two things and to not come at victims and be like, you need to forgive. You need to be in a relationship with that person. You need to pretend like nothing happened. You need to just move on. They said sorry. I'm sorry, but sorry is not enough, Like, that's not enough. But yet I feel like that's what I was force fed growing up. And
huh,
so I have a really hard time with the phrase and saying, like, "Oh, I forgive Dean." It's too it's too complex to reduce it to that sentence, you know? Um, I can't put it like that. But I do believe that forgiveness is important, but more so because of me.